All right. Here we're talking about the American Revolution. Um, and this is information based out of Chapter 7. So there's going to be just a quick overview of some of the battles, some of the things involved with it, and some of the main points that should remember. Take a look at this a few times if you need to, but here we go. So first thing we got to do is compare the Continental Army versus the British Army. So remember, the Continental Army is made up of the colonists living in America during this time period. So we'll take a look at some of the strengths. American strengths. Basically, there's a lot of patriotism. They really believe in what they're fighting for, and that idea of um, gaining independence really is probably one of their biggest strengths. Good leadership in George Washington. Keep that in mind, of course. Doesn't start off great, but ends up really, really in good shape because of some of the decisions that he made. And of course, they're fighting on their home turf. Some of the things that are American weaknesses that really go against them, they don't have much stuff. They don't have shoes, they don't have a lot of guns, a lot of ammo, and essentially they're not very well trained. They have no experience, most of them are farmers, and that could play a factor here. So we look over here at some of the British strengths. Very experienced. On average, British soldier had about 7 years war experience, so that's pretty intense. They were the most well-trained, well-equipped army on the planet. Great Britain, by far, the strongest army around. The weaknesses, they had terrible leaders. They couldn't talk. They were terrible communicators. It was all bad. And of course, they were on unfamiliar terrain. And so that plays a role in it. Not to mention how far away Great Britain is from the colonies, like 3,000 miles. So you got to keep that in mind as well. African Americans and the role that they play in the war, they were kind of wondering, does the Declaration of Independence apply to them? Are all men created equal? And so they started asking questions. Many of them wanted to fight for freedom of the colonies because they hoped it would lead to an end to slavery. So they're like, yeah, let's do this. Let's gain our independence. That means independence for us. A lot of people joined the British Army because the British said, hey, we'll give you guys your freedom, if you fight for us. So they had some questions about what was going to happen, and we'll see what ends up happening historically after the American Revolution with African Americans. So let's talk about some of the battles. Probably the first big battle that they won, really outside that first battle of, the first battles of Lexington and Concord and Boston, was the Battle of Trenton. This is when things started turning around because essentially the American army got pushed out of Boston and New York, most famously New York. But nonetheless, the Battle of Trenton was when things start turning around for the U.S. This is where the famous picture you see George Washington crossing the Delaware with his troops. What ends up happening is he defeats these Hessian mercenaries. These are paid German soldiers by Great Britain. Caught them off guard, and really what this battle does is it shows Great Britain and their allies that the Continentals would fight and they could win. So it was like, oh, wow, these guys aren't all that terrible after all. Show that they could fight and that they could win. So here's the strategies employed by George Washington. Essentially, they started out really slow. They lost a few battles, so he kind of went on the defensive, making the British army come to them and kind of march all over the colonies. And the British, they were hoping to defeat the Continental Army in one big decisive battle and call it good. Okay, so remember that George Washington wants to fight a defensive strategy. Let's talk about the Battle of Saratoga. This is considered the turning point in the war. This battle shows basically that the American allies and the Continental Army could win the war. Okay, I mean, this is a big battle, and this showed that not only could they win a battle, but they could win the war as well. And really, one of the things that you got to remember about this and being the turning point of the war is that this is when France decides to show support for the Americans. So they come in fighting on the side of the Americans against the British. One of the things we got to talk about, remember, there was all these southern colonies as well. The British were like, okay, we've been fighting in New York and Boston, which is up in the north. let's move down to the southern colonies and start going in there. But what they didn't anticipate was this idea of guerrilla warfare, which is like hit and run warfare. In the South, people like Francis Marion really were taking the British off guard and running away because they were in this unfamiliar territory. And essentially, the British were on the run most of the time in the South because of the guerrilla warfare. Then we've got the Battle of Yorktown. This was the decisive battle of the war. Basically, George Washington leads the American troops along with the French army, so they kind of had these two armies rolling, and they relied on the French Navy as well. They surrounded General Cornwallis, and we'll take a look at this map a little bit later, but let me go back to that real quick, and we'll zoom in so you can kind of see. Essentially, what ends up happening is the British are surrounded by the French fleet, which, you know, the British couldn't come and help them. American on one side, French on the other, therefore surrounding the British army, and they had to ultimately surrender. And the Battle of Yorktown kind of marks the end of the American Revolution. Okay, so that gets us to what we call the Treaty of Paris. Okay, this is, you know, was the agreement that was signed at the end of the American Revolution. So what did the U.S. get out of this? Okay, first thing, British recognized the United States as a free and independent country. Yes! American independence, we got there. Way to go. Great Britain has to give up all the land holdings between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean. So that means basically we got, you know, a third of the country we know today is the U.S. So here's a picture of it. So the orange line going down is the Mississippi River. So basically we got all the land east of that, which would include the great state of Michigan, of course. All right, so take a look at that map there. Third thing, United States agrees to give back all land and property taken from the Loyalists during the war. Oh, those Loyalists, they're not moving to England. A lot of them are going to stay in the U.S., and they're going to be happy to be American citizens, but they were granted all the land and property that were taken from them in the end. So that kind of gives you an idea of where everybody ended up after the American Revolution. So that really gets us to where we need to be. And let me show you kind of an overview. Whoops. I think we're all right. All right, so that's it. That's where we want to be. And there you have the American Revolution. Take a look at it. Watch it more than once. Go back, rewind. All right. Do well, ladies and gentlemen.